Hello, this is Robert Rickover. I'm an Alexander Technique teacher in Lincoln, Nebraska. I teach in Toronto, Canada, and these days I'm teaching exclusively online. My guest today is Malcolm Bach, who is an Alexander Technique teacher in Montreal, Quebec. Malcolm is best known for working with runners. He's kind of the running Alexander Technique teacher. He does workshops. I've never been to an annual general meeting where he hasn't been out there hopping around on two legs and running around with all sorts of people following him. He's a fixture. And he does a lot of workshops around the world in running. And we're going to talk today about his experience, which I believe began about 5 years ago, where he ran into some difficulties running and what happened then. Malcolm, welcome to the show.
Great to be here, Robert. Great to see you again.
It's great talking to you. We're both, have Canadian connections, and we've been on workshops. We were in workshops in Montreal together a few times with Tommy and so on. So tell our viewers what happened. You're the running guy, but you had trouble running.
Well,
embarrassing, I would think.
Well, yeah, it's like an Alexander teacher with a bad back, right?
Yeah, I know about that one.
Or a Christian Scientist with appendicitis.
There you go.
There you go. Well, listen, I'm a competitive runner. And now in the masters category. I don't need to mention which category. They go up by increments of 5 years, but 5 years ago, I was training to run a half marathon. It was in the winter. I was in fantastic shape. And on the way home, there's a little hill that leads down to where I live. And it had been raining, and then it got a bit colder, so it was a little bit icy. And as I walked down the hill, one leg slipped a little bit in front of the other, and I felt a little twinge in my hamstring. That's the muscle at the back of your leg.
Right.
And I said, okay, I'll just walk it off a little bit, and I'll be fine tomorrow. And the next day, I started to do a fairly high quality workout, and boom, it went. So I said, okay, don't be an idiot here. Take 2 days off. So I took 2 days off and tried another workout, and bam, it went a little bit harder. It was even worse. So I said, okay, you're really being stupid. Take a week off. And then I went out again after a week, and boom, it went again, and I had to take the bus home. So what I did is I ignored the signals, and I ended up, I think, with a tear in my hamstring. And then I was out. That was it. I had to take quite a bit of time off, and I tried to get it back to normal. And I did the normal things that you do as a runner. Besides Alexander, I did some physio, and that didn't seem to help. And I did some chiro, and that didn't seem to help. And then deep tissue massage, and that didn't really do it. And then some acupuncture, that didn't do it. One thing after another, threw a lot of money at it. And it did get better enough for me to run and even compete a bit, but it was always, never back to where it should have been. And this went on for a couple of years. So I managed it, but it didn't get better. And then a friend of mine in England, a gal by the name of Susie Baker, who's another Alexander teacher, told me about a book called Even With Your Shoes On, which is written by Helen Hall. I highly recommend it. It's a long read, and it's really Helen's voice that comes through it. Anyway, it's quite interesting, and I read it, and I thought, oh, this woman knows a few things about running. So I had a chance to go and work with her, and I did. This was in England, and I was doing some workshops over there, and I said, I've got a little window, and she had a little window, and I went and worked up with her. And I got onto this treadmill system that she had with cameras that she told me cost 80,000 euros. So do the math. It was worth a lot. And it basically could record what you're doing in 4 dimensions. So it's got your force plate on the treadmill and cameras all over the place showing you what your joints are doing in all dimensions. And she put me on that and had me walk and then had me run. And the printout from it had the force going through my feet as I was walking and running being basically a straight line. Okay, so in walking, it was from the heel right through the first or second toe, boom, and then running pretty well the same way, straight line. And she pointed this out to me, and I was quite proud to say, yes, I've been practicing that for you know decades. And she looked at me and she started shaking her head, and she went, no, that's not how your feet are designed to move. And I went, okay, I'll humor her. This machine did cost a lot. And she said, come over here. And she she had me stand in a lunge, and she stuck a wedge under my feet, a couple wedges under my feet, and she had me load, sort of lunge forward and lunge backwards about 8 times, putting weight into my the right leg. That's where I tore the hamstring. And then I got back on the treadmill, and she had me walk and run a little bit, and then she showed me the printout. And I just mentioned that when I walked over to the treadmill after lunging on those wedges, I felt like I was leaning over to one side.
Right.
And I asked her, is that what I'm doing? She says, no, you're walking quite vertically and pretty centered. I said, it feels like I'm over on one side. So she puts me on the treadmill, I run again, and this time, rather than a straight line showing the force going through my foot, it's a squiggly line.
Right.
And she says, that's what we're looking for. And I said, what are you talking about? And she says, when your foot lands, it's meant to pronate. And then when it comes off the ground, it's meant to go back and supinate. So there's a pronating and a supinating going on really quickly.
And I want to interrupt for a second. Just explain to our viewers pronate and supinate. Is that the term?
Supinate. Okay.
Supinate. Just maybe show on that little foot you've got
well,
there.
I thought pronation and supination was sort of like an iPhone, where you tilt the iPhone one way or the wedge one way. I got my iPhone here, so I just do it. So I thought pronation was rolls in, and supination rolls out. And it's sort of like wash on, wash off. And she said, no, that's not what's happening. You've got a foot. And there are 3 parts to the foot. There's the rear foot, the midfoot, and the toes. And she says what's happening is that as the rear foot rolls in, the midfoot opposes it, and the forefoot rolls in. So you've got this 3-way oppositional relationship going on. Every time you pronate, one part goes in one way, another part goes another way, and the third part balances what the first is doing. So the first and third are doing the same thing, and the third is in opposition to them. And it reverses. So when you land on the ground, your foot flattens a little bit. The 2 points of balance up here in the forefoot, the first metatarsal head and the fifth metatarsal head, both stay on the ground. But the foot gets longer and wider. Where have we heard that before? Okay. And the heel rolls a little bit to the inside. And it's designed to do that because if you look at it, you can see it sort of slants down a little bit. So when you put weight on the heel, it tends to roll a little bit towards the inside. It's designed to do that. Now, what most people think of pronation is in fact what's called eversion. It's when the whole foot rolls in like this, and that fifth met head or metatarsal head comes off the ground. That's not pronation, that's eversion. When it pronates, those 2 points stay on the ground, and there's just a lengthening and widening. The foot flattens and spreads out a little bit as it to absorb weight and to create a spring to come back and become a rigid lever, at which point the foot will push you forward and into the next step. So those are the 2 things that are meant to happen. And I'd heard the terms before, but I have to be honest, I had no idea what they meant. I just thought, again, it was like the iPhone, and you didn't want to do it too much. And anyway, she put me back on, and all of a sudden my feet are, there's a squiggly line on the sheet where there was just basically a one line. And I said, oh my goodness, that's completely different. And it was not only different on the leg that she put the wedges onto, my bad leg, it had also changed on the left foot as well. And And even more interestingly, I got a feeling in my hamstring, which I hadn't had for a couple of years of, oh, that feels different now when I'm walking and running. There's not that little in there. It seems like something's let go. Something is working differently.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, huh, this is really interesting. What is this all about? And she said, well, it's all based on this guy, Gary Ward, W-A-R-D, his work on, he wrote a book called What the Foot. And it's based on the fact that he's analyzed what not just the foot, but the entire body, every joint in the body does every time you pronate and supinate through the gait cycle.
Mm-hmm.
And he focused mostly on walking. He's focused on walking. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
so when your foot lands on the ground and then it takes weight and then it goes behind you and it pushes off, every joint in your body reacts to that.
Right, right.
And I looked at her and I went, geez, this is not what I was thinking.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right.
And it goes back to my training as an Alexander teacher. And I was trained by Patrick McDonald, and I worked a lot with Marjorie Barlow, who some of you may know as Alexander's niece and who trained in the first training course with Patrick, and taught the technique her entire life. Wonderful woman. And her concept of walking, which is quite similar to that video you sent me of how Alexander walks,
mm-hmm.
basically is that you've got hip joints, okay? So the legs are meant to move independently from the torso, meaning that the legs move and maybe the arms counter what the legs are doing, but nothing else needs to move, so it shouldn't.
Oh, yeah. Oh,
anyway,
yeah.
that's how it was taught to me.
Yeah.
I know that I was talking to my wife, Lindsay, who's also an Alexander teacher, and she said, well, that wasn't the way we were taught. And I said, well, fair enough. Maybe not everybody out there got brought up with the same concept. Fair enough. But that was mine. So I would teach people to reduce unnecessary movement in the pelvis and in the upper body when they were running, and really try to work things from the shoulder joints and from the hip joints. That's where the movement took place. And there might be a little bit of movement in the torso, but we didn't want too much there. And we certainly didn't want the pelvis doing very much. And again, poor, Helen is looking at me going, well, actually, when you look at what the joints biomechanically do, and we've analyzed this in 4 dimensions.
Yeah.
Okay. They actually do quite a lot.
Right.
And all of a sudden, my brain was, I walked out of there quite happy, but as confused as I'd ever been. And, said, okay, this is interesting. I'm asking a lot of questions at this point, based on my experience, my assumptions, my training, and what I'd been teaching up until that point. So what started to happen is that as I did a very simple, thing with the wedges every day, a couple times a day, eight repetitions, just lunged into that with the wedges, my hamstring gradually got better till I would say it was 90% better, which is basically means it's completely functional. I can run, I can train hard, I could compete. There was still a little bit of, still some things to sort out, but I was well on the way, which no other approach had actually enabled me to do.
Did she give you a specific instructions on where to put the wedges on what foot and
well,
exactly
yes,
how to do it?
The analysis was that basically I wasn't really putting weight into my right foot. So I was not letting my right foot fully pronate, which is what happens when we put weight into the foot when we're walking or running, and the leg and the knee slightly bends, the foot pronates. And I wasn't really letting my foot do that. And she did a bit of an analysis with me and sort of said, okay, tell me a little bit about your history. And and I told her when I was 5 years old, I tore ligaments in my right knee playing tackle football with an older kid who tackled me, and my knee went into a funny place. I tore ligaments, no surgery, basically I crawled around for 6 weeks and it sort of healed.
Yeah.
And then later, playing hockey and football, I damaged that same knee at least 3 more times fairly seriously.
Mm-hmm.
Well, when you hurt your knee, you don't want to put weight on that leg too much because it hurts. So her theory was that I developed a way of walking and running and skating
Mm-hmm.
that basically didn't allow that leg to fully load because I was still subconsciously protecting it.
Right. Right.
Even though the leg had healed, there was no pain in the knee, in the ligaments anymore. Those had all healed and everything. The knee was solid,
Mm-hmm.
but the compensation that I developed unconsciously to
Mm-hmm.
protect it was still a factor.
Right.
So
Yeah. Yeah.
when what she would do is, because my foot wouldn't pronate, so the first metatarsal head, which is the one under the big toe,
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't fully load, when my weight came onto it, wasn't really going down on the ground.
Mm-hmm.
What she did was put a wedge underneath it. So she
So it,
brought the
so it
ground
would
up.
go down on something.
So it would go down and I would feel it, I would sense it, and my brain would begin to get the idea that that's what we wanted. We wanted that contact at that moment in walking and running. When the foot was pronating, we wanted that first metatarsal to fully load. And what she also did was she stuck one underneath my heel
Mm-hmm.
because, in order for that first met head to go down on the ground, the heel and the talus just above the heel, the talus needs to rotate inwards and the heel needs to rotate a little bit so that the weight comes into the inside of the heel. The heel rolls in a little bit like that.
Okay.
Okay.
Oh, so you needed a little extra support
I
at
needed
both
a little bit
ends.
of encouragement for that
Yeah.
heel to kind of roll down a little bit. Okay.
Right. Right.
So she did those two things, very simple. And I'm telling you, 8 reps.
Yeah. For how
Not
long?
not
How
not
long each?
800, not 800. Oh, 1 second.
Oh, really? Really fast.
Just on, hold it, come off. On, wait, come off. And she said, we're not treating you. We're reminding your brain what your foot was designed to do. So,
Right.
and then I interpret that as so that the brain can give a new signal when I'm walking that this is what needs to be allowed to happen. This is how I understood it. And I went, wow, that's really interesting, because we've got a thing in Alexander called direction, where we actually do the same thing to ourselves.
Yeah.
And this is happening without unconsciously. This is just you're doing a movement which produces a different effect, a different feedback, which the brain will then reinterpret and then send a different signal back down. Anyway, that was my interpretation of it, and it worked. And
do you think someone listening to this can figure out on their own, just by experimenting, where the contact is not happening so well, and then do their own wedges, or is it going to
you can
require?
listen. I've taught a number of online classes like yourself. I've gone, mostly to Zoom, and I've been teaching a class once a month to folks a little bit about the things that I've been discovering through. I should mention that I went and did the 6-day intensive, spent a lot of money, and flew to California and did a 6-day intensive with Gary Ward and Chris Sritheran, who's his partner in crime, a little bit on joint mechanics. And I've done a follow-up one since, and done a weekly session with Chris. So I've done a lot of work over the last couple of years. But could somebody figure out a little bit? I like to think, because I give people some basics in the course, that one of the first things you want to do is begin to sense, when you're standing, begin to sense, can you sense the 3 support points on the ground? And one of the things you could do is just shift your weight to one side to the other, and sort of which will bring some points into focus and lessen a little bit others, and do that back and forth a few times, and then stop in the middle and see, do you feel, let's say you're the first met head on your right foot as much as the first met head on your left foot, or is there a difference in contact there?
Right.
And where you feel it's lighter, it's not the same, stick something underneath it. You could stick a wedge, you could stick a face cloth, you could stick a door stop. It doesn't really matter. A book, put something underneath it just to give that side a little sense of contact that you're experiencing on the other side. Because
Mhm.
maybe for some reason, unbeknownst to you, that you've shifted your weight a little bit, in terms of how
Mhm.
you
Sure,
stand.
absolutely.
Uh, it could be an injury, it could be just a habit, it could be, good, well, whatever.
But do
Stage
you do
fright.
you think one wedge should be enough, or would you also have to do the heel
Well,
triangle?
listen, yeah, I've taught a course, and just on the wedges, where I talk a little bit about how the wedges are used from what I've learned from the course with Gary and Chris.
Hmm.
Um, so there is some complexity in there, but I would just start with put one foot forward in a lunge, bend your front knee a little bit, and just notice, do you feel those 3 points, the heel, the first med head, and the third and the fifth med head, you know, that triangle between the heel and the first and the fifth, do you
Hmm.
feel those points being solidly on the ground? But again, we're up against faulty sensory awareness,
Right,
until you really sense them on the ground, you may assume that they're on the ground. And
right, right.
something that I've done in workshops is I've got, somebody who weighs 210 pounds to stand in a lunge and put their weight into the front leg, the bent knee leg.
Hmm.
Everybody knows what I'm talking about, I would
Yep,
assume.
yep,
And say, okay, is your weight firmly on that? This is 200 odd pounds. And I'll come up and I can stick my hand underneath their first med head, under the big
yeah,
toe.
yeah.
And it shows very clearly that they don't have weight going into that toe. They've got weight going into the second, or they're on a skate instead
So,
of a tripod.
but under their toe or under the, not
Under the
under
med
the,
head, under here.
yeah,
I
yeah,
can put my hand
exactly.
right underneath there, which shows
Oh,
that they are not putting weight into
yeah,
that med head.
okay.
So they're assuming that their foot is really on the ground. They would, they and I'm, it's not because I'm particularly strong. It's just because there's no weight under there.
Right.
And then we do some work and get them to, put a wedge under there and get them to load it a few times and come back, and I can't get my hand anymore. And at that point they go, wow, that's completely different. And then they go for a walk and they
Yeah.
say, wow, my foot is coming on the ground, in a completely different way.
So, do you think someone listening to this could experiment and not, even if they weren't sure, they could try under,
Sure.
they could try
Absolutely.
on one side
Yeah.
or the other, and then do these 8 or so reps, which are only like a second or two each, right?
Yeah.
But you
Yeah.
do want your full weight pretty much on the one leg,
Yeah.
and just play with that, and then
Yeah.
take them out, go
Start
for a
with a
walk.
wedge underneath the first med head. So just start with that. You don't even
Yeah,
have to do more than that. Take your towel, stick it under the first one, put some weight there. You're going to feel that contact of that wedge, because this is the pronation. When you're putting weight into your foot, that's when your foot wants to pronate.
right,
Okay. And what you have to make sure is that when you do that, that the last med head doesn't come off the ground. Because
right,
if it does, you're not pronating, you're everting.
right,
Okay.
right,
That
right,
means you're rolling your foot up on the outside of the foot. Okay.
right, right.
That's it. You're rolling it out. You're taking your iPhone and you're treating your foot like an iPhone, and you're just rolling it up. I just put it like that. You're rolling it up on the edge. And what's supposed to happen is that this front edge is supposed to stay on the ground in pronation. Okay. So but this blew my mind, because maybe like a lot of us, I assumed I knew what pronation was, especially in running, because if you go to the store, you can buy shoes that have anti-pronation foam in them, and things to stop your foot from pronating.
Hmm.
I think what they're trying to do is to stop your foot from everting, because pronation is something that your foot should do. It's designed to do, and if it doesn't do it, there are repercussions right up the food chain.
Right, right. So maybe just quickly tell our viewers the dimensions of that
Oh,
wedge.
this wedge here, it's about an inch and a half long, uh, an an inch or so wide. wide, and at height it's about 3/4 of an inch. So a
Okay.
door stop would do just fine. If you want to just
Oh,
go and get
okay.
a door stop, at your local hardware,
Right.
just get a couple of door stops, and a towel will do the same thing. In my workshops, I just use a washcloth and have people put it under,
Okay.
and they get the same benefit. So
Hmm.
this is sort of fancy and it's useful,
Right.
but you can do it with a face cloth or.
So, to step back and look a little at the bigger picture, in your previous interview you did, which led to this interview, you speculated on why it was that Alexander never really seemed to have taught much about feet or worked with people's foot placement, despite the fact that he says in several places, in particularly in Man's Supreme Inheritance and Use of the Self, um, words to the effect that that's really pretty important. And in fact, he says in somewhere, I think maybe it's Use of the Self or maybe MSI, he says in effect, if the habits I had developed around standing, which were to try to grip the floor that he gotten from an acting teacher, which is sort of part of the standard story in the first chapter of Use of the Self, evolution of a technique. The habit I had developed of trying to grip the floor, which of
Yeah.
course is a kind of an insane thing to try to do, but had caught until I dealt with that. He says very explicitly, anything I did up here with my head and neck didn't have the power to overcome that. It was a pretty explicit, very explicit statement. So you would think, okay, not everyone had the same kind of acting training he did, but many people have developed habits, injuries as a result of injuries, that distorted the way their feet came down, that would be something he might have worked with in teaching, but we don't seem to have any record of that. And you had an interesting theory about why that was. Could you share that
Geez,
right
I don't. I was probably being a bit silly there, Robert. I'm not sure. What was it? Because I don't know. In Victorian times, you didn't
Yeah,
take your shoes off, or
yeah, he didn't, and maybe
maybe
he
he
did.
didn't want to get on his hands and knees and work on people's smelly feet, or
Yeah, yeah,
I don't know. We could speculate it, or maybe he was just so damn good with his hands that he could get the changes. Working up here on the head and neck, he could get people's feet to change. Because of I remember taking a lesson with McDonald and felt my feet were going right into the center of the earth, and he wasn't getting anywhere near my feet. So maybe he
right.
could produce those changes. I don't know, but
But I know
it's
on my training course, and I assume on yours, that sort of thing didn't come up particularly.
not at all, not at all.
And I've
And
I've seen very little, if any, discussion about foot use or the use of the foot as
well, Chris
I've.
Stevens was beginning to investigate it a little bit
Mhm.
back in the 90s. I think sadly he died way too early. He was
Right.
beginning to investigate it, but this is coming from an outside source. Gary Ward, as far as I know, he hasn't even had an Alexander lesson before. He's quite Alexandrian in his approach, though he's very much a means whereby sort of person.
Hmm.
And he's basically his idea was, well, what happens in gait when you walk? What actually happens in the foot, and how does that affect the rest of the body? So you in fact could talk about when you pronate, there is a pronation shape or reaction in the entire body.
Hmm.
And when you supinate, there's a reaction in the entire body, which led me to the whole thing about Alexander's direction of knees forward and away. And where I think that for myself at least, maybe other Alexander teachers have not, suffered this in the same way that I did, but knees forward and away to me meant, and it was taught this way to me, that forward meant forward from the hips or forward from the back, and away meant away from each other.
From
And
each other.
well, it has to be from each other because otherwise it would be redundant. Why would you say forward and away if you were just talking about in relation to the back,
Oh, I
right?
always
For,
assume that's not, that direction, I gotta say, is not one that I have ever used or thought about. And I'm not honestly sure we even talked about it on the training course, but I assume when people are saying that, they mean knees away from their hip joint.
well, why would you say forward? What's the forward?
Well, away in a forward direction.
Well, they can only go forward.
Well, no, you could rotate them around. They could
Well, they
move.
do. Yeah, you can no, but the forward means forward from the hips and away from the hips. That's being redundant. And I don't think I would argue this quite strongly that Alexander was very careful with his use of words, as we know. He went on and on and on trying to be clear
Right.
with description
Uh-huh.
of experience. He wouldn't have said forward in a way if twice. He wouldn't if it meant the same thing twice. Forward meant forward meant is my understanding, and this is how it was taught, and this is how
Mhm.
McDonald understood it, was forward from the hips and away from each other. Okay,
So
and
forward and then out to the side a little.
out a little bit. Yeah. So when you see people, the way we were taught it is that as you stood up, the knees went slightly away from each other. And when you see people going into monkey, you see the knees going out, let's say, over the second toe. Right? That's the general direction. It's sort of almost a yoga-like direction. The knees are going out over the second toe. So that makes sense some of the time.
Mm-hmm.
But the problem with that direction that is that when your knees go out and away from each other, your feet supinate, they don't pronate.
Mm-hmm.
They can't. You can't move your knee out and rotate your talus and your feet in. It's physically impossible.
Mm-hmm.
So for your feet to pronate, right, the knees have to go forward and in. Now, I know this might sound like splitting hairs, but think a little bit about when you see, especially through the McDonald stream, but I think in other streams as well, when you see people going into monkey,
Mm-hmm.
their knees are generally going out, the toes are turned out slightly, and the knees go out over the second toe.
Oh,
Right? But
yeah,
in
I guess so. I
gait,
never really, yeah. But
okay, but in
for
gait, when you load the leg, when you put weight into the leg and you bend it, you're in pronation, and the knee should be going in. So to me, and this has ripples right up through the pelvis, through the
sure,
spine,
yeah.
it will affect the head as well.
Well,
So
let me ask you a
yeah,
question, because we're using this technical language, and I think a lot of people might not immediately be able to latch on to this.
okay,
But what I've noticed is that it seems to me that when I'm walking well, the
yes,
weight comes down on the heel,
yes,
and it seems like then as I then move forward, ideally it seems like there should be a kind of a brief moment when it's mostly on the back of the lower toe, but very quickly goes towards the center, towards the back of the big toe. There's
yeah,
almost, and that would be knees coming in.
yes,
It would be, it seems like, well, let's see if I can, boy, this is tricky. If this is the big toe and this is the heel of the foot, and so of course that big joint is further away than my
yes,
thumb
yeah,
is, up, be up here somewhere, but
yeah,
the other one would be here somewhere, right?
yeah,
It seems to me that the weight comes down here, quickly passes through there, and almost instantly gets there
yes,
for the and it's there for the takeoff for the next step.
no,
But there, yeah, does
no,
that make no? Not
no,
there for the takeoff. Where
no,
is it for the takeoff?
little toe.
Little toe.
Yeah. So what it means, Robert, is that your pelvis isn't moving when you walk,
Mm-hmm.
because if your pelvis doesn't move,
Mm-hmm.
your leg cannot externally rotate, and you can't get you can't get the weight moving so that it's loading the little toe side a little bit more on takeoff. So that's what supination is that it comes down, like you said, it rolls in, and as it comes off, it rolls out just a little bit.
Oh, so there's a little return so that
It
it's
supinates.
both those points are more or less equal weight bearing?
No,
Or,
the little toe has a little bit more on it as your foot comes off the ground.
oh, really?
Yeah, that's called supination. But if your pelvis doesn't move, you can't supinate very well. So you'll basically be doing, you will supinate, but not as fully as you could do, which means that the rest of your body cannot respond as well and as fully as it could if your foot actually went through the correct range of movement.
So the weight doesn't then go all onto the part below the big toe. It's partly there, still partly on the.
It's on both places, but there is at this point the talus, this bone right here, is externally rotating. Your pelvis is externally rotating, and so the foot now is becoming a rigid lever, and this fifth med head has got weight coming into it. It's not just roll off the inside of the foot.
Okay.
And it's the same thing for running as well, So a lot of people who just toe off like this all the time, they're not fully supinating. They don't get the same power that they would if they actually supinated fully. So to me, and I'm saying this to you not as an expert, but as something that I've learned in the last 2 years. I thought I understood this. I've been running for decades. I thought I understood it. And as I began to understand a little bit more fully what supination is and what pronation is, it's changed my thinking. Now, these are not huge movements, Robert. You're not rolling all the way over and all the way over, but it can be measured. And if you're walking, if you're on a force plate and you're walking, you can see where the forces move in your foot through the gait cycle. As your foot lands, flattens, moves, rolls through, and comes off, you will see where the weight, where it goes. And we can then trace up from that at the various moments of the gait cycle, what's happening in the rest of the body. So I can tell you, Robert, just from what your description is, that your pelvis does not fully rotate.
Could be.
Yeah, and you can check that out tomorrow. When you go for a walk, just think a little bit about your pelvis moving a little bit more. Make your walk a little bit sexier is what I'm saying to you, Robert.
It's hard to do.
And I know. And see, you might exaggerate it. I have people do it and just have some fun with it. Just see what happens when your pelvis moves a little bit more. What do you notice happening in your feet? Where's the pressure in your feet now? Is it different? And I actually start with them just loading the foot and unloading it in the lunge to get a sense of it, and then letting that play out in the walk, because it's happening so quickly, you can't consciously control it in real time.
Sure. Yeah.
You have to allow it to happen.
But do you think for, again, someone who's wanting to explore this on their own could basically stand with and play around with shifting weight from one foot to the other?
Absolutely.
And simply noticing and just experiment, maybe making little circular movements or movements that would give you information about where on the foot is
absolutely. And begin to become more aware of pressures in their feet, where they notice pressure, when they land. I think there's a book coming out now that says that, when you walk, you're meant to land on the forefoot and then let the heel come down after. And, and I'm going, well, maybe that's one theory about walking, which doesn't really match the, the design of the foot. You've got a big, thick heel bone here. And we know from Wolff's law that when you put stress on bone, it reactions by building up more bone. So, if we've developed developed a foot like this over millions of years and it's nice and thick down there, it probably means that that's what hits the ground first and takes most of the shock.
Well, it's sort of
right?
analogous to your sits bones when you're sitting. I mean, they are big, solid bones
That's right.
that are pretty clearly designed to support you
To
when
take
you're
weight.
sitting in
Yeah.
a chair, and not so much your sacrum.
Yeah,
you know,
exactly.
yeah. So, if someone wants to learn more, I will put a link to your website by the interview. Can they get in touch with you? Do you do classes on this?
Yes, I do. I'm offering a class the first Saturday of every month from 9 to 11 Eastern Standard Time. And there's something that I send out. I send out a couple of reminders to the everybody who's a member of AMSAT and everybody who's on my list. So if you sign up to my list on my Art of Running workshop website, you'll get an email announcing when the next class is. And I just explore with people a little bit some of these ideas. I give them lots of practical things, exactly what you're asking. You know, it's hard to do in such a short amount of time, but I give people lots of practical things to try out. And one of the bits of feedback, I don't know if you saw that, Robert, there was a violinist who said, you know, just by paying attention to the balance on the 3 points, his sound changed and he found shifting a little bit.
On the Facebook page.
Yeah, and I thought, well, isn't that's kind of cool?
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah. And I thought, well, listen, anything that can help people move a bit better, enjoy walking or running, or, you know, in this case, it was playing his violin, can enjoy that a bit more. I think we need to put out there, you know, this is information that needs to be shared. And when you look at Alexander walking, you know, maybe you should put that on the web page as well. You see, basically, his knees move quite a lot, but nothing moves from the hips up. And you know, and I don't know if that was a Victorian thing that you know you weren't supposed to let your pelvis move very much. You know, is maybe.
Oh, this is the video. So there is a video. There's some videos of Alexander out at his country estate or whatever it was.
Walking across the lawn, carrying a stick or something.
The lawn, and you get a really good front view of him walking, and you can see his knees, and it's pretty, and feet.
Yeah.
It's quite, and you can slow it down because a nice function on you. It's on YouTube. Maybe I'll make sure I include that in my.
Oh, really? I actually went out and bought this machine called a Vidami machine, which means I can slow down any videos I want to on YouTube.
Well, you can on YouTube, you can slow it down to a quarter speed.
Oh, that's fantastic.
There's
so you
a
can
little
really
setting
see
for that.
Yes.
Yeah.
And, you know, my feeling is if Alexander had video, he would have used it because, especially in something like walking and running, where things are happening so fast, you know, things that we're describing here are happening in a fraction of a second. Right. It doesn't mean that they're not important, but they're happening really quickly, and it's impossible to see them without the use of something like video. But once you see them, you know, it's like, you know, looking in the microscope. Oh, we can see, we can see things that, you know, cells and, you know, viruses and things like that. And we kind of go, oh, maybe they might be important. I'm being slightly, you know, you know, these days you know, so the same thing comes with movement. You know, we can see things now and we can understand things in a way that, you know, perhaps people couldn't as clearly before.
Oh, Alexander, if he'd been around now when he was doing his initial experiments, he'd have camcorders set up and slow motion viewing and so forth. He wouldn't.
I would have thought.
I mean, I do like mirrors, but they have their limitations, and he would have moved on from that. So maybe I'm thinking this would be a good place to end the conversation, unless there's something that you especially want to add.
Well, I wanted to add this whole idea of a shape between a pronation shape and a supination shape. So when we're standing up with our legs straight, that would be a supination shape leg, because the leg is straight. Okay, the leg should be slightly externally rotated. The weight should be a little bit towards the outside of the foot, but without taking the first med head down off the ground. Um, and when you're bending your knees, like when we go into monkey, that's basically a pronation shape. Okay, so at that point, the knee should be going slightly in to allow the foot to pronate. The leg should be rotated in a little bit, allowing a little bit more weight towards the inside of the foot. Okay, and I was just experimenting today, doing a little bit of work with my wife here on the table, saying, well, when I'm standing, when I'm in monkey, could I let my legs, as my hands, by the way, it's also reflected in the hands. When you pronate on one side, your arm is meant to pronate on the same side. Interesting. And then when you supinate, your arm is meant to supinate on the same side. So just playing a little bit with that on the table, you change your hands, let's say from a pronating hand direction. When you've got your hand, somebody said, to a supinating hand direction, turning out, you start to notice that all of a sudden your feet, the pressures on your feet start to change without you doing anything about it. If you're fairly free. If you're locked up, you won't notice any changes. Anyway, so I thought, well, this is a much more dynamic way of using monkey than just the knees bending and your hips bending and your ankles bending. There's actually a pronation and supination action that's sort of coming, that's there underneath the surface and is connected to what you're doing with your hands, which I'm just beginning to explore. And I thought I'd throw that out there because it's juicy and it's lots of fun. And for us, one of these days we will be able to work on people again in person. And, it's something, you might want to maybe begin to think about. So, yeah, I just throw that out there, Rob. Thank you.
So I will put relevant links next to our the video, and you can, if you want to learn more about this, you can follow up by contacting Malcolm and maybe taking his class. So Malcolm, thank you so much for this, and
you're very welcome, Robert. It's great to see you.
It's been fun.
Yeah. I wish you'd been wearing your T-shirt though. I was looking forward to that.
Yeah, I should have.
Yeah. Oh, well.
My Alexander Expert T-shirt. Yeah.
Yeah, love that.
It's great. Okay, thank you. Take care.
You're very welcome. Take care, Robert. Thank you.